What they never told you about the world. After the Holocaust. Secrets buried for decades. This is not a retelling of what the Holocaust was, the world already knows. It was one of history's darkest chapters. Instead, this is a journey into the world. After the horror ended, a world still trembling from the shockwaves of genocide. The war was over, but the scars remained carved into nations, cities, and souls. Survivors stepped out from the ashes into a fractured world, one that often refused to acknowledge their suffering. Incredibly, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, there were voices that denied it ever happened, ignoring mountains of testimony and the silent weight of millions of lost lives. This story is not just about politics or statistics. It is about the slow, painful process of rebuilding, the cultural shifts that followed, and the countless personal tragedies hidden behind grand historical events. From refugee camps overflowing with displaced souls, to the revival and near extinction of a language, to the theological questions that shattered centuries-old beliefs, the aftermath of the Holocaust was as complex and haunting as the tragedy itself. What followed was a battle not fought with tanks and guns, but with memory, justice, and the desperate fight to reclaim humanity. In the immediate years after World War II, the weight of the Holocaust hung heavily over Europe, but the reactions were far from uniform. German society, confronted with undeniable evidence of mass murder, often turned inward, choosing silence over confrontation. Many tried to reshape their national history into something less damning, while the government strictly restricted access to archives like those in Bad Arolsen. For decades, these documents remained sealed, hidden under the guise of privacy concerns. It was only in May 2006, after 2 decades of persistent effort by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, that between 30 and 50 million pages were finally made available to survivors, historians, and researchers. The war's end left millions displaced among them, countless Jews who had lost nearly everything, their families, their homes, and their communities. Though the Allies initially planned to repatriate these people to their countries of origin, many refused to return. For some, their hometowns were nothing but ruins. For others, they were places still steeped in anti-Semitism and danger. Over 250,000 Jewish refugees remained in displaced persons camps for years, living in harsh conditions, sometimes under armed guard, as revealed in the damning Harrison report. Immigration quotas in Western countries made relocation painfully slow. For many, the British Mandate of Palestine became the most realistic hope. Yet even there, the path was blocked. Britain resisted large-scale Jewish immigration, fearing Arab opposition. This gave rise to Brecha, a vast underground network operated by former Jewish partisans and members of the Haganah. Against the odds, they smuggled some 250,000 Jews, including both displaced persons and those who had survived the war in hiding, into Palestine. With the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, that path opened legally, and by the time the displaced persons camps closed in 1952, tens of thousands had resettled in Israel, the United States, and smaller numbers across Mexico, Japan, Africa, and South America. Still, for many who stayed in Europe, especially Poland, a surge of violent anti-Semitism after the war made survival impossible. Pogroms in Kielce and other cities drove waves of emigration as survivors realized they were still not safe, even in peace. The refugee crisis and the search for a new home. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the war's survivors were left standing in a Europe that felt unrecognizable. For Jewish survivors in particular, home was often nothing more than a memory. Entire neighborhoods had vanished, synagogues reduced to rubble, and family trees left with only 1 or 2 fragile branches. The Allied plan to return displaced persons to their countries of origin may have looked orderly on paper, but in reality it was cruelly naive. Many towns had been destroyed beyond recognition. In others, returning Jews found their homes occupied by strangers, their property seized, and local communities unwilling, sometimes violently unwilling, to see them back. The cold truth was that anti-Semitism had not died with the Nazi regime. In many places, it simply wore a different face. For those trapped in displaced persons, DP camps, daily life was a bitter paradox. The war was over, yet they still lived behind fences and under guard. American-administered camps in particular came under fire in the Harrison report for their inhumane conditions, overcrowded barracks, meager rations, and little sense of dignity or freedom. For survivors who had endured ghettos and concentration camps, these DP camps felt like a cruel continuation of captivity. Immigration laws in many Western countries remained tight. The United States, for example, maintained restrictive quotas that left countless refugees waiting years for approval. For some, the British Mandate of Palestine represented hope, a place to begin again. But Britain, fearing unrest from the Arab population, closed its gates to large-scale Jewish immigration. This deadlock gave birth to Breacher, flight in Hebrew, a daring underground network run by former Jewish partisans and the Haganah militia. In the shadows of post-war Europe, they smuggled some 250,000 Jews across borders, through forests, over mountains, and onto ships bound for Palestine. The risks were enormous for every family that made it through. Others were intercepted, detained, or turned back. Yet Breacher persisted, fueled by the conviction that survival was not enough. Life must also have a future. When the State of Israel declared independence in 1948, the gates opened at last. Jewish refugees could immigrate legally, without the fear of being deported back into danger. By 1952, as DP camps finally closed, about 136,000 Jewish survivors had resettled in Israel, 80,000 in the United States, and thousands more across Africa, South America, Japan, and Mexico. But the refugee crisis was more than a logistical challenge. It was a human drama unfolding in every corner of the post-war world. The displaced carried not only their few remaining possessions, but also an unspoken burden, the trauma of survival in a world that had allowed them to be hunted, and that was now slow to help them rebuild. The cultural and linguistic loss. The decline of Yiddish. Before the Holocaust, Yiddish was more than just a language. It was the heartbeat of millions of Jewish lives across Eastern Europe. It carried lullabies from mothers to children, jokes told in crowded marketplaces, the poetry of entire generations, and the cadence of prayers whispered in small-town synagogues. On the eve of World War II, between 11 and 13 million people spoke Yiddish fluently, making it one of the most vibrant minority languages in Europe. In the interwar years, Yiddish culture was not only surviving but flourishing. In Poland, there was a renaissance of Yiddish literature, theater, and newspapers. Even in the Soviet Union, despite heavy political pressures, Jewish schools and publishing houses kept the language alive. Yet cracks had already begun to show. Urbanization, assimilation, and the pull of majority languages like Russian, Polish, and German were slowly eroding Yiddish-speaking communities. In the United States, the shift was even faster. Immigrant parents spoke Yiddish, but their children quickly switched to English, leaving the mother tongue behind within a single generation. The Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939 marked the beginning of a near-total cultural annihilation. The ghettos and extermination camps did not just kill individuals, they destroyed the very communities that had nurtured Yiddish for centuries. An estimated 5 million Holocaust victims, roughly 85% of them Yiddish speakers, were murdered. In towns where once the streets rang with Yiddish conversation, there was now only silence. The destruction was not only demographic but also symbolic. Books, archives, and cultural centers were deliberately burned, erasing the written and recorded history of Yiddish life. Even survivors who emerged from the war often chose not to teach the language to their children. For them, Yiddish was bound up with memories of persecution and loss, and they feared passing on that pain. By the war's end, Yiddish was in a steep and irreversible decline in Europe. While pockets of the language survived in the United States, Israel, and parts of South America, it had lost its geographic heart. The post-war Jewish world, particularly in Israel, favored Hebrew as the language of national rebirth, leaving Yiddish to occupy a smaller, more nostalgic role. Today, scholars, artists, and cultural activists work to preserve what remains of Yiddish literature and music. But the Holocaust's impact was so devastating that the language's pre-war cultural ecosystem can never be fully restored. The loss of Yiddish is more than the loss of words. It is the loss of a worldview, a shared humor, a rhythm of life that once bound millions together across borders. In this sense, the Holocaust did not just take lives, it severed the linguistic and cultural threads that had held the Jewish people's diasporic identity for centuries. Faith in crisis. Theological questions after the Holocaust. The Holocaust did not just devastate cities, communities, and cultures. It struck at something far deeper, the very foundation of faith. For centuries, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam had shared a common belief in a God who was omnipotent, omniscient, and benevolent. Yet, in the shadow of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek, these convictions faced an unbearable question. How could such evil exist in a world governed by a just God? In Jewish thought, this challenge crystallized into what became known as Holocaust theology, an ongoing struggle to reconcile divine goodness with the reality of mass extermination. Some scholars and religious leaders argued that the Holocaust was a mystery beyond human comprehension, like a child unable to understand the life-saving but terrifying hands of a surgeon. Others saw it as evidence that God had withdrawn from the world, leaving humanity to its own moral ruin. The statistics were staggering. 6 million Jews murdered, 1/3 of the global Jewish population erased, and Eastern Europe's Jewish community reduced by 90%. While some theologians limited the definition of the Holocaust to the Jewish victims, others included the additional 5 million non-Jewish victims, bringing the total death toll to around 11 million. For some survivors, faith did not survive the camps. The silence of God in the face of mechanized slaughter seemed like abandonment. For others, paradoxically, the Holocaust deepened belief, reinforcing the idea that human understanding could never grasp the full plan of the Creator. Orthodox Jewish voices in particular argued that tragedy, however incomprehensible, could not invalidate the covenant between God and Israel. These theological debates rippled far beyond religious communities. The philosopher Theodor Adorno famously declared, "To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric," a stark expression of how deeply the Holocaust seemed to shatter the very foundations of human meaning and creativity. Yet, in defiance of despair, art and literature continued, often led by survivors themselves. Elie Wiesel, Primo Levi, Viktor Frankl, and Anne Frank became enduring voices of witness, ensuring that the Holocaust would be not only remembered but wrestled with in the human conscience. In every monotheistic faith, the Holocaust became a touchstone for re-examining the problem of evil. Was suffering a divine test, a consequence of free will? Or was it a sign that the world's moral fabric was far more fragile than believers had imagined? What is certain is that the Holocaust did not just challenge theology, it forced a confrontation with the limits of human understanding itself. In the decades after the war, these questions did not fade. They became an essential part of post-war religious and philosophical discourse, ensuring that the moral and spiritual reckoning of the Holocaust would echo for generations. The Holocaust's impact on art, memory, and cultural preservation. The Holocaust was not only a historical catastrophe, it became a permanent rupture in the world's cultural and artistic landscape. Before 1939, Jewish creativity thrived in literature, painting, theater, and music. After 1945, much of that cultural ecosystem had been burned away. What remained was a haunting question: how do you create art after Auschwitz? Theodor Adorno's warning, "To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric," reflected a deep fear that beauty might trivialize horror. Yet, against this grim sentiment, many survivors and witnesses chose to create precisely because they had to speak. Their works were not aesthetic luxuries but acts of remembrance and moral resistance. Some of the most enduring literature of the 20th century emerged from this period. Elie Wiesel's Night, Primo Levi's If This Is a Man, and Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning were not simply memoirs, they were urgent testimonies. Anne Frank's diary, discovered after her death, transformed into a universal voice for innocence crushed by tyranny. These works crossed languages, borders, and cultures, ensuring that the Holocaust would remain in global consciousness. Cinema, too, became a powerful medium for remembrance. Films like Schindler's List, The Pianist, and Life is Beautiful won international acclaim not only for their artistry, but for their role in humanizing history. Each film offered a different lens, from harrowing realism to bittersweet hope, yet all carried the same imperative: do not forget. With survivors aging, the late 20th and early 21st centuries saw a race against time to preserve their voices. Projects like Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation undertook massive oral history collections, recording thousands of testimonies. Institutions such as Yad Vashem in Jerusalem and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., became living archives, housing documents, photographs, and personal artifacts that tell the story in human terms. The Holocaust also left deep scars on the visual arts. From 1933 to 1945, Nazi Germany looted an estimated 600,000 artworks from museums and private collections, many owned by Jewish families. Worth roughly $2.5 billion, in 1945 around $30 billion today, these stolen pieces remain a legal and ethical minefield for collectors. Even now, Before purchasing pre-1945 European art, buyers must investigate whether a piece was plundered from Holocaust victims. Art restitution cases have stretched into the 21st century, involving institutions and governments from US. Supreme Court rulings against Austria to compensation demands on German industries that profited from forced labor. In each case, the pursuit of justice is tangled with memory. In this way, the Holocaust's impact on art is twofold. It destroyed entire creative worlds, and yet it also birthed a new era of remembrance-driven expression. Every book, film, painting, or recovered artifact is not just a cultural object, it is a fragment of survival, a defiance of erasure. The long road to reparations and the politics of remembrance. Justice after the Holocaust was never simple. The crimes were so vast, so unprecedented, that no legal or financial settlement could truly compensate for what was lost. Yet survivors and the fledgling state of Israel pressed forward, determined to secure reparations not as a price on suffering, but as recognition of wrongs committed. Immediately after the war, in 1945, the Jewish agency under Chaim Weizmann petitioned the Allied powers for reparations from Germany. The request was largely ignored, but by March 1951, Israel's foreign minister Moshe Sharet presented a formal demand, $1.5 billion, a sum calculated based on Israel's costs in rehabilitating 500,000 Jewish survivors. West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer acknowledged Germany's moral responsibility and agreed to negotiate. The resulting talks, joined by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims against Germany, were contentious. Many Israelis viewed accepting German money as blood money, a betrayal of the dead. Yet practical realities prevailed. Israel was a young nation, struggling under the weight of mass immigration and scarce resources. By the final agreement, Germany committed to pay $845 million in direct and indirect reparations over 14 years. The process did not end there. In 1988, West Germany approved another $125 million in payments. In 1999, lawsuits targeted German corporations like Deutsche Bank, Siemens, and BMW for their role in wartime forced labor. To settle, Germany created a $5 billion fund for surviving forced laborers, granting one-time payments ranging from $2,500 to $7,500. In 2012, Berlin agreed to another €772 million for survivors in need, followed in 2014 by $60 million from France's state-owned railway, SNCF, for its role in deportations. Yet the reparation system was not free from corruption. In one scandal, $57 million was fraudulently claimed by individuals not eligible for Holocaust compensation. Such abuses undermined public trust and gave critics ammunition. Norman Finkelstein's controversial book, The Holocaust Industry, accused some Jewish organizations of exploiting Holocaust memory for political and financial gain. While many disputed his arguments, the controversy underscored how deeply entangled Holocaust remembrance had become with politics, identity, and international diplomacy. At its heart, the reparations debate revealed a fundamental truth. No sum could restore what had been destroyed: lives, families, centuries of culture. But the act of restitution carried symbolic weight. It said, "We acknowledge this happened. We bear responsibility." This link between property and memory became central to post-war Europe's political culture. As historian Dan Diner argued, the Holocaust became a unifying moral reference point for Europe, driving the 1992nd restitution movement and embedding remembrance into the continent's identity. By returning stolen assets, Europe was also returning fragments of history and, in doing so, preserving the truth of what had been lost. Holocaust denial and the fight against historical amnesia. In the decades after World War II, a new and insidious challenge emerged, one that did not involve armies or weapons, but words and lies. Holocaust denial began to circulate, rejecting the most well-documented genocide in history. These deniers claimed the Nazi government had no deliberate plan to exterminate Jews, that death tolls were wildly exaggerated, and that gas chambers were a fabrication. They preferred the term Holocaust revisionism, attempting to cloak their distortion in the language of legitimate historical debate. But scholars drew a clear line. Revisionism reinterprets history using evidence. Denial ignores or distorts overwhelming evidence to fit a predetermined agenda. At its core, Holocaust denial was and is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, portraying the genocide as a hoax designed to advance Jewish interests. The methods of denial were predictable, cherry-picking data, relying on forgeries, and exploiting minor factual disputes to undermine the entire historical record. German-British journalist Alan Posner warned that Germany's own cultural output, its films, television series, and media, often failed to engage younger audiences responsibly, feeding a dangerous gap in knowledge. Studies revealed the consequences. A 2017 Kerber Foundation survey found that 40% of 1-4-year-olds in Germany did not know what Auschwitz was. In 2018, a US poll showed that 66% of millennials could not identify Auschwitz, and 41% wrongly believed fewer than 2 million Jews were killed. Nearly half of Americans could not name a single concentration camp or ghetto. Awareness of the Holocaust's reach into the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, was virtually non-existent among those surveyed. In contrast, a study in Israel found young people often invoked Holocaust memory as a rhetorical tool in political debates, proof that, while the event was remembered, its meaning could shift in modern discourse. The global response to denial and ignorance has been to enshrine remembrance in official calendars. On the 1st of November, 2005, the United Nations General Assembly declared the 27th of January the anniversary of Auschwitz-Birkenau's liberation in 1945 as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Countries from Europe to the Americas now hold ceremonies, educational programs, and exhibitions on this date. In the United States, an equivalent commemoration begins on the Sunday before Yom HaShoah, 27th of Nisan in the Hebrew calendar, and lasts a full week. These moments are more than memorials. They are acts of resistance against forgetting. The fight against denial is ongoing. It demands not only education, but storytelling, the voices of survivors, the records of liberators, the testimony of history itself. Because if the world allows the memory to fade into myth or distortion, the door opens for history's darkest chapters to be repeated. Lesser-known facts and unusual legacies of the Holocaust. When people think of the Holocaust, they often picture the same tragic icons. Auschwitz's gates, the ghettos, the piles of shoes and suitcases. But the aftermath of this genocide contains lesser-known threads, details that reveal how far its consequences reached into law, culture, and even the mundane acts of daily life. One such thread is the link between property and memory. Historian Dan Diner observed that the restitution of stolen goods in the 1992nd was not merely about returning assets, it was about unlocking the past. When families recovered a painting, a silver menorah, or a bundle of letters, it often triggered memories that had been buried for decades. In this way, restitution became a form of historical excavation, restoring not only objects but fragments of personal and communal identity. Another little-known fact: the scale of Nazi art theft was staggering. Approximately 600,000 works looted between 1933 and 1945. Even today, the ownership history of countless paintings must be meticulously traced before sale to ensure they weren't taken from Holocaust victims. This has reshaped the global art market, making provenance research a permanent and costly necessity. There are also human stories hidden in bureaucratic corners. For example, in 2014, France's National Railway, SNCF, agreed to pay $60 million to American Holocaust survivors for its role in transporting deportees to Nazi camps. This settlement meant that nearly 70 years after liberation, survivors were still receiving acknowledgement, not from governments alone, but from companies that had once been cogs in the machinery of genocide. Then there's the haunting statistic from Israel. As of 2016, about 45,000 Holocaust survivors were living below the poverty line. Despite the billions in reparations over decades, many survivors continue to struggle with inadequate healthcare, housing, and daily support. Some protested publicly, accusing their own government of failing those who had endured humanity's worst crime. Even health bore the scars of genocide. Studies found Holocaust survivors had cancer rates nearly 2.5 times the national average in Israel, and colon cancer rates 9 times higher. Grim legacies of starvation, malnutrition, and chronic stress during the war. These details may seem scattered: art, law, poverty, illness, but together they paint a fuller picture of the Holocaust's reach. It was not a tragedy confined to wartime years. It was a wound that kept bleeding into every sphere of life for decades afterward, and in some ways, it still bleeds today. The Holocaust ended in 1945, but its shadows have never truly lifted. What followed was not a clean break from the past, but a long, uneven struggle between memory and forgetting, between justice and the impossibility of full restitution. Survivors rebuilt their lives in strange lands, carrying invisible wounds. Cultures like Yiddish, once vibrant and unshakable, were reduced to fragile remnants. Faith was tested, sometimes shattered, sometimes deepened. Art and literature bore the burden of remembrance, while the courts wrestled with how to assign value to the invaluable: human dignity, stolen lives, stolen history. Even now, the fight continues against denial, against the slow erosion of collective memory. Every testimony, every restored artifact, every act of commemoration is a refusal to let silence win. The Holocaust legacy is not just about the horrors inflicted, but about the moral responsibility that rests on all who inherit its story. Because history, left untold, can be twisted, and pain, left unacknowledged, can return. The Holocaust is not just a chapter in a history book, it is a warning, written in ash and blood, to all future generations. It tells us, remember, so that never again is not just a promise, but a reality.